The Vampire King had owned the roadside motel for decades, helping travelers without them ever knowing his true nature. Until tonight, when a desperate woman's labor cries drew him to room 12, and he realized her newborn's heartbeat called to him in ways that would shatter every rule he'd made about staying hidden. Marcus Delacroix pressed his palm against the peeling paint of room 12's door, feeling the tremors of Elena's anguish vibrate through the thin wood like a tuning fork struck against his ancient bones. The scent hit him next, copper and salt, and something indefinably human that made his fangs ache in ways he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. Rain drummed against the motel's tin roof, each drop echoing the rapid pulse he could hear through the walls. And the fluorescent light above his head stuttered like a dying heartbeat, casting fractured shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot where his carefully ordered world was about to shatter. He'd stood in this exact spot 1,000 times before, listening to the sounds of human suffering from behind closed doors, always walking away because involvement meant exposure and exposure meant death. But tonight, something primal and ancient clawed at his chest as another cry tore through the darkness. Elena Reyes had checked in 3 hours ago, her hands shaking as she signed the register with a false name, her brown eyes darting toward every shadow as if expecting her demons to materialize from the Nevada desert that stretched endlessly beyond the Moonrise Motel's neon glow. She was 24 and running. That much Marcus could smell on her like fear, sweat, and desperation, her belly swollen with a child she was determined to birth alone rather than risk the questions that came with hospitals and insurance cards and government databases that could lead Jake Morrison right back to her door. Marcus had watched her struggle with her single suitcase, had seen the bruises on her wrists that spoke of restraints and violence, and had felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought dead for 2 centuries, something dangerously close to protective instinct. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The Vampire King who had ruled the Northwestern Territories since 1847 had built his reign on careful distance, on the strategic isolation that came with owning a roadside motel where transient guests paid cash and asked no questions about the pale proprietor who never seemed to age. He'd purchased the Moonrise in 1976 after the previous owner suffered an unfortunate accident involving a rattlesnake bite that definitely wasn't from any serpent native to these parts, transforming the run-down establishment into the perfect hunting ground where he could feed on travelers who wouldn't be missed, whose disappearances would be attributed to the harsh desert or their own poor choices, rather than the creature who welcomed them with coffee and clean sheets before draining their lives away. 47 years of perfect control, of maintaining his human facade so completely that even his own kind sometimes forgot what lurked beneath the mundane exterior of Marcus the motel owner, and now Elena Reyes was about to destroy it all with her refusal to die quietly. Another scream split the night, and Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble as medical instincts older than his vampiric nature surged to the surface. Memories of battlefield tents and dying soldiers, and the oath he'd taken as a human physician flooding back with stunning clarity. He'd been Dr. Marcus Delacroix once, had worked the surgical tents during the cholera outbreak of 1832, had held dying children in his arms, and sworn to preserve life above all else, before Catherine found him bleeding out in an alley and offered him eternal existence in exchange for everything human he'd once been. The woman behind the door needed help, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to provide it, Vampire King or not. But helping meant revealing skills no normal motel owner should possess, meant exposing reflexes too fast and strength too precise, and knowledge too deep for someone who claimed to have learned first aid from a weekend course at the community college. Marcus closed his eyes and felt the weight of his throne pressing against his shoulders like a burial shroud. felt the expectations of his court and the carefully negotiated treaties with neighboring territories, and the delicate balance of power that kept the supernatural world hidden from human awareness. All of it balanced on the knife's edge of his decision to knock or walk away. The rain grew heavier, and Elena's cries grew weaker, and Marcus realized that some choices made themselves. His knuckles rapped against the door 3 times, sharp and decisive, and Elena's voice cracked as she called out that she was fine, that she didn't need help, that he should please just go away and let her handle this alone. Marcus spoke through the wood, his voice carrying just enough supernatural compulsion to cut through her panic without overwhelming her will, telling her that he was the owner and he had medical training, and that whatever she was running from couldn't be worse than bleeding out alone in a $30 a night motel room. The silence stretched long enough for him to wonder if she'd lost consciousness. Then the lock clicked and the door swung open to reveal Elena Reyes, propped against the bathroom doorframe, her face pale as moonlight, and her dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat and effort. She was beautiful in the way that broken things could be beautiful, all sharp angles and fierce determination, and when she looked at him with those deep brown eyes, Marcus felt something shift in his chest, like tectonic plates finding new alignment. She stepped aside and he entered her temporary sanctuary, noting automatically the scattered towels and the jerry-rigged birthing setup she'd constructed from motel supplies, his enhanced senses cataloging her vital signs and the progression of her labor with clinical precision, even as his hands moved to help her back to the bed. Elena trusted him because she had no choice, because pain had stripped away her ability to maintain the walls she'd built around herself, and Marcus found himself slipping into the role of healer with an ease that should have terrified him. His hands moved with inhuman precision as he guided her through each contraction, his voice steady and reassuring as he coached her breathing. His supernatural strength carefully modulated to seem merely competent as he positioned towels and checked her dilation and prepared for the moment when new life would enter a world that had already marked them all for death. The baby crowned during a thunderclap that shook the motel's foundation, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he saw the tiny head emerge, perfectly formed and slick with birth fluids that carried a scent unlike anything he'd encountered in his long existence. Elena pushed with everything she had left, and Marcus caught the infant as she slipped free from her mother's body, his hands cradling something so small and perfect that for a moment he forgot entirely what he was, forgot about territories and courts, and the careful balance of fear that kept lesser vampires in line. The baby drew her first breath and released a cry that stopped Marcus's heart, a sound that resonated not just in his ears, but in his bones, in the marrow-deep places where his vampire nature lived and breathed and waited. The frequency was impossible, mathematically perfect at exactly 432 hertz, the golden ratio of sound that ancient vampire texts claimed could awaken dormant bloodlines and restore power to courts that had grown weak with age and complacency. Sofia Elena Reyes entered the world with a heartbeat that called to every supernatural instinct Marcus possessed, and he realized with crystal clarity that this child could either save his dying court or destroy everything he'd built in the human world. Elena reached for her daughter with trembling arms, and Marcus placed the baby against her chest, watching as Sophia's cries gentled into soft mewling sounds that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. The new mother looked up at him with gratitude shining in her exhausted eyes, thanking him over and over for saving them both. But Marcus was already thinking 3 steps ahead, already calculating the cost of what had just happened, and the choices that would follow, like dominoes falling in precise sequence. He cleaned up the aftermath of birth with movements too efficient and disposal methods too thorough for someone who claimed to be just a helpful motel owner, and Elena was too focused on her daughter to notice the way he never quite met her eyes, or the way his skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Sophia's heartbeat settled into a rhythm that made Marcus's own dead heart attempt to match its cadence, and he found himself staring at the infant with something dangerously close to wonder. something that felt suspiciously like the protective instinct that had gotten so many of his kind killed throughout history. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, Elena cradling new life, while Marcus grappled with the implications of what that life might mean, and then his phone buzzed with the harsh reality of a text message from an unknown number. The words glowed on his screen like a death sentence written in cold fire, each letter driving home the truth he'd tried so hard to avoid. "We know what you're hiding. The council is coming." Marcus felt his carefully constructed human facade crack like ice under pressure as he stared at the message, knowing that somewhere in the darkness beyond the motel's neon glow, ancient eyes were watching and ancient minds were calculating the exact price of his newfound humanity, and that Elena and her miraculous daughter had just become the most dangerous things in his immortal existence. Dawn crept across the Nevada desert like spilled blood, and Marcus stood at the motel office window, watching shadows that moved wrong, tracking movement patterns that spoke of surveillance and patience, and the kind of predatory focus that only came from his own kind. The Vampire King had lived long enough to recognize the signs when his territory was being scouted, the subtle disturbances in the natural order that meant hunters were circling and evaluating and preparing to strike, and the realization that they'd been watching for weeks made his ancient blood run cold, with implications he wasn't ready to face. 3 separate scent trails crossed the parking lot in patterns too deliberate to be coincidence. Vampire musk layered beneath human deodorant and rental car exhaust. The careful camouflage of predators who knew exactly what they were hunting and had all the time in the world to plan their approach. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through the guest reviews for the Moonrise Motel, finding the breadcrumbs his watchers had been following like a trail of digital destruction leading straight to his carefully guarded secret. 5-star review after 5-star review praised his exceptional kindness, his willingness to help stranded travelers, his uncanny ability to solve problems that should have required professional intervention, and Marcus felt his jaw clench as he realized his own compassion had become the weapon being used against him. Elena was trapped in room 12 with Sophia, still bleeding from childbirth and weak from the trauma of delivery. Her rusty Honda Civic refusing to start despite Marcus's attempts to repair the alternator that had failed precisely when the Nevada winter decided to dump 18 inches of snow across the interstate. The blizzard had been building for 3 days, transforming the desert landscape into something alien and hostile, cutting them off from civilization just as effectively as if they'd been marooned on a distant planet where the only law was survival and the only currency was blood. Marcus moved through the motel with purposeful efficiency, his hands steady as he replaced every lock with custom deadbolts that contained iron cores blessed by priests whose names had been lost to history, each mechanism designed to hold against supernatural strength while appearing utterly mundane to human observation. The UV lights came next, industrial-grade security fixtures that he installed under the guise of upgrading the motel's safety features, positioning them to create overlapping fields of lethal radiation that would turn any vampire foolish enough to approach into screaming ash in seconds. Elena watched his work through the window of room 12, her brown eyes tracking his movements with growing curiosity, and Marcus felt the weight of her attention like sunlight on his skin, warm and dangerous, and impossible to ignore. She was beautiful in ways that transcended physical appearance, her fierce determination to protect Sophia shining through her exhaustion like steel wrapped in silk. And Marcus found himself working harder than necessary to catch her eye, to earn the small smile she offered when their gazes met across the frozen courtyard. Elena interpreted his protective preparations as romantic interest, the kind of attention she'd never received from Jake Morrison or any of the other men who'd passed through her life, like storms leaving only destruction in their wake. And Marcus felt something twist in his chest when he realized she was falling for a fantasy, for the human man he pretended to be rather than the monster he actually was. His phone rang as he finished installing the last UV fixture, David Chen's name lighting up the screen like a warning beacon. And Marcus answered with the careful neutrality he'd perfected over decades of ruling through calculated distance rather than emotional attachment. David's voice carried the weight of centuries, his lieutenant's concern bleeding through the digital connection as he reported movement in vampire territories across 3 states. Old bloodlines stirring to wakefulness as rumors spread about a king who'd forgotten his place in the natural order. The conversation that followed revealed the brutal arithmetic of vampire society, the way territorial laws had been written in blood and enforced through violence since the first courts formed in medieval Europe. And Marcus felt the familiar weight of his crown settling across his shoulders like a mantle made of thorns and regret. Protecting humans was seen as weakness in their world, a sign that a ruler had grown soft and sentimental, and therefore vulnerable to challenge. And David's warnings carried the unmistakable subtext that Marcus's enemies were already sharpening their claws for a revolution that would leave the northwestern territories painted red with royal blood. Sophia's heartbeat pulsed through the walls of room 12 like a supernatural metronome, each beat making Marcus stronger and faster and more dangerous than he'd been in decades. His vampire nature responding to the child's unique frequency with changes that felt like evolution and devolution happening simultaneously. The power was intoxicating and terrifying, strength flowing through his limbs like liquid fire while his control frayed at the edges, his carefully maintained human facade cracking under the pressure of instincts that demanded he claim and protect and kill anything that threatened his newfound family. Marcus hung up the phone and stared at his reflection in the office window, seeing red eyes staring back at him for just a moment before his iron will reasserted control and forced them back to their usual pale blue, the color of winter sky and old ice, and the kind of cold that killed without mercy or remorse. Elena's car finally started on the 4th day, the engine turning over with reluctant cooperation, but the roads remained impassable, and the snow kept falling, and Marcus found himself grateful for the weather that kept them isolated, even as it trapped them together in an intimacy he hadn't allowed himself to experience in over 2 centuries. He brought Elena meals from the diner next door, simple food made extraordinary by the care with which he presented it. And they talked about everything except the obvious questions that hung between them, like smoke from a fire that refused to die. Elena shared stories about her childhood in Phoenix, about dreams of becoming a teacher, and plans for Sophia's future that didn't include running from monsters both human and otherwise, while Marcus offered carefully edited versions of his own past that painted him as a drifter who'd found peace in the desert's harsh beauty. She discovered the newspaper clippings by accident, old yellowed articles about Harold Brennan's mysterious disappearance in 1976, tucked inside a maintenance manual she'd been reading to pass the time. And Marcus felt his blood freeze as he realized his carefully buried history was rising from the grave like a corpse that refused to stay dead. The previous owner had been a cruel man who preyed on stranded travelers in ways that had nothing to do with supernatural hunger and everything to do with human evil, and Marcus's decision to drain him dry had been as much about justice as territory, though he doubted Elena would see the distinction if she learned the truth. That night, Marcus performed the protection ritual he'd been avoiding for 3 days, moving through room 12 while Elena slept with Sophia cradled against her chest, his bare feet silent on carpet that had seen too much pain and not enough healing. The silver coins came from a purse he'd carried since his human death, Spanish reales blessed by a priest who'd died defending his village from creatures far worse than vampires, and Marcus placed them at the cardinal points while whispering words in languages that predated written history. Dried herbs followed the silver, sage and vervain and mountain ash, arranged in patterns his vampire sire had taught him during the dark years when survival meant learning to blend protection magic with predatory instinct. Each plant carrying properties that would repel supernatural evil while strengthening the bonds between those who sheltered within the circle. The blood came last, 3 drops from his palm mixed with water from a spring that had run pure since before humans learned to write. And Marcus felt the ritual take hold, like invisible chains wrapping around room 12 and everyone inside, binding them together in ways that transcended species and mortality and the gulf between predator and prey. Sophia fell ill the next morning, her tiny body burning with fever that spiked dangerously close to the temperatures that killed human infants, and Elena's panic filled the room like smoke while Marcus's enhanced hearing caught the subtle changes in the baby's heartbeat that spoke of respiratory distress and possible sepsis. His knowledge of rare infant ailments came from decades of study and centuries of observation, from watching human medicine evolve while his own supernatural nature remained unchanged, and Marcus found himself diagnosing Sophia's condition with precision that no normal motel owner should possess. The antibiotics came from his private medical supply, drugs he kept for emergencies that required him to maintain his human facade, and Marcus administered the injection with movements too steady and dosage calculations too precise for someone who claimed to have learned first aid from weekend courses. Elena watched him work with growing suspicion, her intelligent eyes cataloging details that didn't quite fit the story he'd been telling. But Sophia's fever broke within hours, and her heartbeat strengthened, and Elena's gratitude temporarily overwhelmed her questions about Marcus's impossible competence. Jake Morrison arrived with the sunrise on the 7th day, his pickup truck sliding through the melting snow like a predator following a blood trail, and Marcus felt every protective instinct in his ancient soul surge to murderous attention as Elena's abusive ex-boyfriend stepped out onto the parking lot with legal papers in one hand and barely contained violence radiating from every line of his body. The man was everything Marcus despised about humanity's worst impulses, all entitled rage and casual cruelty wrapped in expensive clothes and legal authority, claiming paternity rights to a child he'd never wanted while threatening Elena with court battles she couldn't afford, and custody arrangements designed to destroy rather than nurture. Marcus met Jake in the parking lot with his human mask firmly in place, polite and deferential and utterly harmless in appearance. But Elena could see the tension coiled in his shoulders like a spring compressed past its breaking point, could hear the dangerous edge creeping into his voice despite his careful words. The confrontation escalated with inevitable momentum as Jake revealed his true intentions. His plan to use Sophia as leverage to drag Elena back into the cycle of abuse and control that had driven her to flee across 3 states, and Marcus felt his centuries of careful self-control begin to fracture like ice under pressure. Jake made the mistake of grabbing Elena's arm, his fingers digging into flesh still tender from childbirth, while he hissed threats about taking everything she loved. And Marcus moved without conscious thought, crossing the distance between them in a blur of supernatural speed that left Jake staggering backward with his wrist bent at an impossible angle. The display lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Elena's sharp intake of breath confirming that she'd seen exactly how fast Marcus had moved, how precisely he'd applied force to disable without killing, how his pale blue eyes had flashed crimson for just a moment before reasserting their human disguise. Jake fled with his tail between his legs and his legal papers scattered across the melting snow. But the damage was done, and Marcus found himself standing in the parking lot, with Elena staring at him, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. Her brown eyes wide with the kind of recognition that could only end in death, or revelation, or something far more dangerous than either. The silence that stretched between Marcus and Elena in the aftermath of Jake's departure felt heavy enough to crush bones. And Marcus could hear the rapid flutter of her heartbeat mixing with Sophia's supernatural rhythm in a symphony that spoke of terror and recognition and the kind of understanding that changed everything forever. Elena stood frozen in the doorway of room 12 with her daughter pressed against her chest, her brown eyes wide with the shock of witnessing something that defied every law of physics she'd ever learned, and Marcus felt the weight of 2 centuries pressing down on his shoulders as he realized the moment of truth had finally arrived. He could kill her now, could move with the supernatural speed she'd already witnessed, and snap her neck before she had time to scream, could bury her body in the desert where the coyotes would scatter her bones, and no one would ever think to look for a runaway mother who'd been fleeing an abusive relationship. The thought crossed his mind with clinical detachment, the same cold calculation that had kept him alive and in power for longer than most vampires survived. But when he looked at Elena holding Sophia with fierce protective love blazing in her eyes, Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest like tectonic plates finding new alignment. Instead of violence, he chose vulnerability, his voice steady and calm as he told Elena the truth about what he was, about the centuries he'd spent walking between worlds, about the supernatural nature that made him faster and stronger, and infinitely more dangerous than any human man she'd ever known. The words fell into the space between them like stones dropped into still water, each revelation sending ripples through Elena's understanding of reality, until Marcus could see her mental framework reshaping itself to accommodate impossible truths about monsters and magic and the thin membrane that separated the world she knew from the darkness that lurked just beyond human perception. Elena listened without interruption as Marcus explained about vampire courts and territorial boundaries, about the ancient hierarchies that governed supernatural society, and the delicate balance of power that kept creatures like him hidden from human awareness. And when he finished speaking, she was quiet for so long that Marcus began to calculate escape routes and contingency plans for protecting Sophia if Elena's fear overwhelmed her reason. But instead of screaming or running or demanding explanations that would force him to choose between exposure and murder, Elena surprised him by stepping closer, her intelligent eyes studying his face with the kind of careful attention she might give to a mathematical equation that required solving rather than a monster that required fleeing. She told him she'd suspected something was different from the moment he'd entered room 12, that his medical knowledge and impossible competence, and the way shadows seemed to bend around him had triggered instincts she hadn't known she possessed, but that everything he'd done since Sophia's birth had been aimed at protecting rather than harming, and that counted for more than whatever supernatural nature he might be hiding. Elena's acceptance hit Marcus like a physical blow. The simple trust she offered cutting through centuries of carefully constructed emotional armor with surgical precision, and he found himself explaining things he'd never shared with another living soul about the loneliness of immortal existence and the weight of ruling creatures who respected only strength and the careful balance he'd maintained between his vampire nature and the humanity he'd never quite managed to abandon. Marcus revealed his true identity as king of the Northwestern Territories, a realm that stretched from the Pacific coast to the Rocky Mountains and encompassed more supernatural creatures than Elena could have imagined in her worst nightmares. But the title came with responsibilities and enemies and a constant struggle to maintain power in a world where weakness was rewarded with death and sentiment was considered the ultimate vulnerability. The High Council in Europe viewed his protection of humans as corruption, Marcus explained, a sign that he'd grown too attached to mortal concerns and forgotten his place in the natural order where vampires ruled and humans served as livestock for supernatural appetites that knew no mercy or restraint. Elena absorbed this information with the same fierce intelligence she'd shown throughout her ordeal, asking pointed questions about vampire politics and territorial disputes that revealed a mind capable of grasping complex power dynamics, even when those dynamics involved creatures that shouldn't exist. Marcus found himself telling her about the ancient prophecies written in languages that predated human civilization, texts that spoke of a child whose heartbeat would resonate at frequencies capable of either awakening dormant vampire bloodlines or serving as a weapon that could destroy supernatural society entirely. Sophia represented something unprecedented in vampire lore, Marcus continued, a bridge between human and supernatural worlds that could reshape the balance of power in ways that terrified beings who'd spent millennia perfecting systems of control based on fear and predation rather than cooperation and mutual benefit. The child's unique frequency had already begun affecting Marcus in ways that strengthened his vampire abilities while simultaneously making him more vulnerable to human emotions, a combination that could either elevate him to unprecedented power or destroy everything he'd built over 2 centuries of careful rule. Elena understood the implications with startling clarity, recognizing that she and Sophia had become pawns in a game whose rules she was only beginning to understand. But instead of demanding escape or rescue, she proposed something that took Marcus's breath away with its audacious simplicity. She offered alliance, partnership between a runaway mother and a vampire king who needed each other more than either was willing to admit, Elena requiring protection from both Jake's legal threats and the supernatural forces that now knew about Sophia's existence, while Marcus needed her cooperation to keep the child safe from creatures who would see her as either salvation or destruction. The arrangement felt impossible and inevitable simultaneously. Two beings from completely different worlds finding common ground in their shared determination to protect something precious and fragile and utterly unique in a universe that seemed designed to destroy anything that dared to be extraordinary. Marcus knew that accepting Elena's partnership meant choosing between his throne and this makeshift family. That vampire society would never tolerate a king who put human concerns above supernatural law. But when he looked at Sophia sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, he realized the choice had already been made somewhere deep in his ancient soul. They were still negotiating the terms of their uneasy alliance when Cassandra arrived 3 nights later, stepping out of a black sedan with the predatory grace that marked her as something far older and more dangerous than the vampire scouts who'd been watching the motel for weeks. Marcus felt her presence like ice water in his veins, the unmistakable signature of a council emissary who carried the authority to speak for vampires whose names had been feared since before humans learned to write, and he moved to intercept her in the motel lobby before she could get within sensing range of Sophia's supernatural heartbeat. Cassandra Thornfield had been beautiful once, before 3,000 years of existence had burned away everything soft and compassionate and recognizably human, leaving behind something that looked like a woman but moved like a serpent, and spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who'd forgotten that pain had meaning beyond tactical advantage. She surveyed the Moonrise Motel with obvious disdain, her pale eyes cataloging every detail from the faded carpets to the flickering neon sign. And when those ancient orbs focused on Marcus, he felt the weight of her disapproval like acid on his skin. The council knew about his human sympathies, Cassandra informed him with voice like poisoned honey, about his protection of mortal travelers, and his failure to properly cull his territory of the weak and unworthy, and they had decided that Marcus Delacroix had forgotten what it meant to be vampire royalty in a world where only the strong deserved to survive. Elena listened from the shadows behind the front desk, her breathing carefully controlled as she absorbed the reality of vampire politics and the casual discussion of human lives as if they were livestock to be managed rather than people with hopes and dreams and inherent worth. Cassandra's demands were simple and non-negotiable, Marcus learned as the conversation progressed with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche gathering speed. The council required immediate surrender of the child whose heartbeat had been detected by their most sensitive monitoring equipment, along with Marcus's abdication of his throne in favor of someone more suitable to vampire sensibilities. The alternative was trial by combat against 3 council champions, Cassandra explained with the enthusiasm of someone describing an entertainment rather than a death sentence. Ancient law that would determine whether Marcus retained his territory or died screaming while his human pets watched helplessly from the sidelines. Elena stepped into the light before Marcus could respond, her chin raised with the kind of defiant courage that had carried her through childbirth alone and would probably carry her through whatever came next. And Cassandra's expression shifted from bored superiority to genuine surprise as she realized the human had been listening to their entire conversation. The ancient vampire studied Elena with predatory interest, noting the intelligence in her brown eyes and the protective stance that placed her between potential threat and the room where Sophia slept. and Marcus felt his control slip dangerously close to the edge as Cassandra's lips curved into a smile that promised pain and suffering, and the kind of creative cruelty that came from millennia of practice. Marcus had been king for over 200 years, Elena learned as Cassandra detailed his reign with the casual thoroughness of someone reading from a personnel file, ruling through a careful balance of fear and respect that had kept the Northwestern Territories stable while other vampire courts tore themselves apart in succession wars and territorial disputes. The trial would take place within 3 nights during the new moon when vampire powers reached their peak, Cassandra continued, her ancient eyes never leaving Elena's face as she explained exactly how Marcus would die if he failed to defeat opponents who'd been chosen specifically for their ability to kill vampire royalty with maximum suffering and minimum mercy. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that Marcus accepting this challenge meant almost certain death, but refusing would result in immediate execution for all of them, including Sophia, whose only crime was being born with a heartbeat that threatened the supernatural status quo. The choice hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Marcus looked at Elena holding their daughter with fierce determination blazing in her eyes, and knew that whatever happened in the next 3 nights would reshape the vampire world forever, one way or another, and that the woman who'd given birth alone in room 12 had just become the most dangerous ally or enemy that supernatural society had ever faced. The 48 hours that followed Cassandra's ultimatum transformed the Moonrise Motel into something between a fortress and a training ground, with Marcus moving through preparations for combat that would determine not just his survival, but the fate of everyone he'd come to care about, in ways that defied centuries of carefully maintained emotional distance. Elena watched him work with the kind of focused intensity she'd only seen in war documentaries, his movements precise and economical as he cleared furniture from the largest room and began practicing forms that looked like dancing, until she realized each gesture was designed to kill with maximum efficiency and minimum wasted motion. The Vampire King taught her about supernatural weaknesses and defensive strategies, his voice steady and clinical as he explained how iron could burn vampire flesh and UV light could reduce ancient predators to ash, how certain herbs could mask human scent from supernatural senses, and specific prayers could provide limited protection against creatures that predated organized religion. Elena absorbed the information with the same desperate hunger she'd once applied to studying for final exams, recognizing that her life and Sophia's depended on understanding rules that governed a world she'd never known existed, until a few days ago, when a pale stranger had knocked on her motel room door and changed everything forever. Marcus revealed pieces of his human past during their training sessions, his carefully controlled voice carrying the weight of memories that had been buried for over 2 centuries, beneath layers of supernatural necessity and royal obligation. He'd been Dr. Marcus Delacroix during the cholera epidemic of 1832, a battlefield medic who'd worked the surgical tents where dying soldiers were brought in endless streams of blood and screaming, and the kind of suffering that broke strong men's minds like twigs snapping under pressure. Elena listened as Marcus described holding children in his arms, while they died from diseases that modern medicine could cure with simple antibiotics, about the oath he'd taken to preserve life above all else, and the crushing weight of helplessness when his human knowledge proved insufficient against the relentless advance of death. Catherine had found him bleeding in an alley after he'd been attacked by looters who thought a doctor's bag might contain drugs worth stealing, Marcus continued, his ancient eyes distant with the pain of remembering, and she'd offered him eternal life in exchange for everything human he'd once been, promising power enough to save everyone he couldn't protect as a mortal man. The transformation had been agony beyond description, Marcus explained, every cell in his body dying and being reborn as something fundamentally different, something that craved blood instead of food and feared sunlight instead of embracing it. But the trade had seemed worthwhile when he realized he could finally fight death on equal terms instead of watching helplessly as it claimed victim after victim. Sophia's influence continued expanding beyond anything Marcus had experienced in his long supernatural existence, her unique heartbeat creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the motel's boundaries and affected creatures Elena couldn't even see. Birds began avoiding the area entirely, their instincts warning them away from something that registered as both predator and protector simultaneously, while electronic devices malfunctioned with increasing frequency, as if Sophia's frequency interfered with the basic principles that governed modern technology. Marcus's own vampire abilities accelerated under the child's influence, his healing factor becoming so rapid that cuts closed within seconds and bruises faded before Elena could properly examine them, his strength and speed increasing daily as if Sophia's presence was awakening potential that had lain dormant for decades of careful human mimicry. The supernatural enhancement came with costs that Marcus tried to hide from Elena, his control fraying at the edges as primal instincts grew stronger, and the careful balance between vampire nature and human conscience became increasingly difficult to maintain. Jake Morrison returned on the second day with a court order and 2 sheriff's deputies, his swagger restored by legal authority and the backing of law enforcement officers who had no idea they were walking into a situation that defied every assumption they'd ever made about reality and justice and the nature of threats that required their intervention. Elena felt her blood freeze as she watched Jake climb out of a patrol car with papers that claimed paternity rights and custody arrangements that would tear Sophia away from her mother and place the child directly in the hands of a man who'd never wanted her, except as a tool for inflicting maximum emotional damage. Marcus met them in the parking lot with his human facade perfectly maintained, his voice respectful and cooperative as he listened to Jake's demands, and the deputy's explanations of legal procedures that would have to be followed regardless of weather conditions or personal circumstances. But Elena could see the tension coiled in Marcus's shoulders like compressed steel, could hear the dangerous edge creeping into his polite responses as Jake revealed his true intentions to drag both mother and child back into the cycle of abuse that had driven them across 3 states in desperate flight from violence that wore a human face. The situation escalated with sickening inevitability as Jake grew bolder under police protection, his voice rising as he described Elena's mental instability and unfitness as a mother, his lies flowing with the practiced ease of someone who'd perfected manipulation as both art form and survival strategy. Marcus's control snapped when Jake grabbed for the papers one deputy was examining, his movement too fast for human eyes to track as he placed himself between the abuser and his prey. And Elena felt her breath catch as she watched those pale blue eyes flash crimson for just a moment before supernatural compulsion rolled out like invisible fog. The deputies suddenly remembered urgent calls requiring their immediate attention, their expressions going blank and distant, as Marcus's voice wove patterns in their minds that would send them driving away with no memory of why they'd come or what they'd been asked to do. Jake found himself alone in the parking lot with a man whose predatory stillness finally penetrated his arrogance enough to trigger genuine fear, and Elena watched through the window as her ex-boyfriend stumbled backward toward his truck, with terror replacing swagger, and promises to return with better preparation dying unspoken on his lips that had gone pale with recognition of something far more dangerous than human anger. The display of vampire compulsion sent ripples through the supernatural world like stones dropped in still water, Marcus's use of mental influence alerting creatures across hundreds of miles that something unprecedented was happening in the Nevada desert, something that involved powers beyond normal vampire abilities and implications that threatened the careful balance between hidden and revealed worlds. David Chen arrived that evening with reinforcements that surprised Elena with their apparent humanity, 2 vampires who could have passed for college students if not for the predatory grace that marked them as creatures who'd never been human at all, despite their youthful appearances. Marcus's lieutenant brought news from the vampire underground, reports of movement in territories across the western states, as ancient bloodlines responded to rumors about a child whose heartbeat could reshape supernatural society, and a king who'd chosen humans over his own kind's survival. The loyal vampires who'd come to stand with their king carried weapons that belonged in museums rather than modern combat. Swords forged from metals that didn't appear on any periodic table and blessed with rituals that predated written history. But Elena could see the genuine affection and respect they held for Marcus, shining through their supernatural nature like warmth from a carefully banked fire. David's presence brought comfort and complications in equal measure, his centuries of experience providing tactical advantages, while his obvious disapproval of Elena's influence on his king created tension that crackled through every conversation like static electricity waiting to discharge. Marcus began feeding more aggressively as the trial approached, his need for strength overriding the careful moderation he'd maintained for decades of peaceful coexistence with the human world around his territory. Elena tried not to think about what feeding meant in practical terms, about the travelers and drifters who checked into remote motels and never checked out, about the careful disposal of evidence and the families who would never know what happened to their missing loved ones. The Vampire King's increasing brutality created moral complications that Elena struggled to reconcile with the gentle man who'd saved Sophia's life and protected them both with tenderness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than supernatural obligation or territorial instinct. Cassandra's agents began pressuring Elena through channels she hadn't expected. Human operatives who appeared at the diner next door with offers of safe passage and new identities in exchange for cooperation with council objectives that would ensure Sophia's survival, even if it meant abandoning Marcus to face his fate alone. The ancient vampire's psychological warfare was subtle and effective, playing on Elena's maternal instincts and fear for her daughter's future while painting Marcus as a dangerous obsession whose protection would ultimately destroy everything she claimed to want to save. Elena found herself questioning decisions that had seemed clear just days before, wondering if her feelings for Marcus were genuine or simply trauma bonding amplified by supernatural influence. Whether keeping Sophia near a vampire king was protection or the worst kind of endangerment disguised as love. Marcus sensed her growing uncertainty with supernatural perception that made hiding emotions impossible, and Elena could see him pulling away emotionally even as his physical protection intensified, his vampire nature interpreting her doubt as betrayal that confirmed every harsh lesson he'd learned about the impossibility of trust between species. The distance between them grew as Marcus's preparations became more violent, and Elena's horror at his necessary brutality created barriers that neither seemed able to cross without abandoning fundamental aspects of who they were beneath the desperate circumstances that had thrown them together. Sophia continued growing stronger under the influence of supernatural energies that surrounded the motel like invisible storm clouds, her brown eyes tracking movements Elena couldn't see, while her tiny hands reached for shadows that seemed to reach back with equal curiosity. The baby's supernatural awareness manifested in ways that both fascinated and terrified her mother. Moments when Sophia's gaze would focus on empty corners with the kind of attention that suggested she was seeing things that existed beyond normal human perception. Marcus's presence calmed the child in ways that defied rational explanation, Sophia's cries gentling to soft sounds whenever the vampire king entered her line of sight, as if she recognized something in him that transcended species boundaries and spoke to connections that existed on levels deeper than blood or biology. Elena discovered the truth about Marcus's recent feeding on the final night before the trial, finding evidence in the form of personal effects that belonged to travelers who'd checked in but never checked out, items that told stories of lives interrupted and families who would never know closure. The confrontation that followed carried the weight of every moral compromise and ethical sacrifice that had led them to this moment. Elena's accusation that Marcus had become the monster she'd feared meeting his cold reminder that survival in their world required choices that couldn't be measured by human standards of right and wrong. The vampire king stood before her covered in blood that wasn't his own, his ancient eyes reflecting centuries of similar choices and the crushing weight of power that demanded sacrifice from those who wielded it. And Elena realized she had to choose between the man who'd saved her life and the mother who would do anything to protect her daughter, even if it meant walking away from the only person who truly understood the danger they faced. The abandoned warehouse that served as their supernatural coliseum sat 30 miles outside of town, like a monument to industrial decay, its corrugated metal walls rising from the Nevada desert floor like the ribs of some massive dead beast that had been picked clean by scavengers and left to rust under stars that seemed too bright and too close in the thin desert air. Marcus stood at the edge of the makeshift arena, while Cassandra's agents transformed the space according to protocols that had been written in blood during the Dark Ages, when vampire courts settled their disputes through ritualized violence rather than political maneuvering. Their movements precise and reverent as they painted symbols on concrete floors with substances that gleamed like liquid starlight in the harsh fluorescent illumination. Elena clutched Sophia against her chest in the designated witness area, her brown eyes wide with horror as she absorbed the reality of what was about to unfold. The ancient machinery of supernatural justice grinding toward a conclusion that would determine not just Marcus's fate, but the future of everyone she'd come to care about, in the surreal days since her daughter's birth, had changed everything. The three council champions stood in formation at the arena's center, each representing a different aspect of vampire lethality, honed over centuries of practice and refined through countless battles that had left only the strongest and most ruthless survivors to claim their place in the supernatural hierarchy that ruled through fear and maintained power through the absolute certainty that weakness would be rewarded with death. Dmitry Volkov embodied brute force in its purest form, his massive frame carrying muscle that had been enhanced by vampire transformation until he resembled something carved from granite and animated by malevolent will, his scarred hands flexing with anticipation as he studied Marcus, with the predatory focus of a creature who'd earned his reputation by crushing opponents literally and figuratively until their bones were powder and their blood was memory. Valentina Rossetti moved like liquid mercury given human shape, her speed so profound that Elena's human eyes could barely track her movements as she flowed through practice forms that seemed to bend reality around their execution. Her pale fingers trailing vapor that suggested the vampire venom she'd perfected into an art form capable of killing other immortals through doses measured in molecular precision rather than crude application. Erebus stood apart from his companions with the stillness that marked truly ancient vampires, his appearance shifting between forms as if his physical body was merely a suggestion rather than fixed reality, his dark eyes holding depths that spoke of magic learned during humanity's childhood when the boundaries between possible and impossible were negotiable rather than absolute law. Marcus faced his opponents with calm that came from 2 centuries of ruling creatures who respected only strength. His pale blue eyes cataloging weaknesses and advantages with the clinical detachment of someone who'd survived longer than most vampires managed, by thinking tactically rather than emotionally. Though Elena could see the tension coiled in his shoulders like compressed steel waiting for release. Sophia's heartbeat provided the rhythm for everything that followed, her unique frequency pulsing through the warehouse like a supernatural metronome that seemed to synchronize with the ancient protocols governing trial by combat, each beat making the air itself vibrate with power that Elena could feel in her bones, even though she couldn't understand what it meant or how it would affect the violence about to unfold. Cassandra watched from an elevated platform with the detached interest of someone observing laboratory experiments, her ancient eyes cataloging every detail of Marcus's preparation, while her lips curved into a smile that promised pain regardless of who emerged victorious from the coming battles that would reshape the balance of power in the vampire world. The first challenge began without ceremony when Dmitri launched himself across the arena with speed that belied his massive frame, his clawed hands reaching for Marcus's throat with the kind of direct assault that had crushed dozens of opponents who'd underestimated the intelligence hidden beneath his brutish appearance. Marcus avoided the attack through precise footwork rather than superhuman speed, using the warehouse's industrial architecture to his advantage as he led Dmitri into a deadly dance among support pillars and abandoned machinery that turned the arena into an obstacle course, favoring strategy over raw power. Elena watched in horrified fascination as Marcus demonstrated why he'd ruled for 2 centuries, his movements economical and purposeful as he turned Dimitri's strength against him, using leverage and momentum to send the larger vampire crashing into concrete walls with impacts that shook the entire building and sent clouds of dust raining down on the assembled witnesses. The battle raged through the warehouse with destructive fury that left Elena clutching Sophia tighter as debris flew around them like shrapnel, Marcus's tactical brilliance gradually wearing down his opponent's advantages until a perfectly timed strike sent Dmitri tumbling through a window that had survived decades of abandonment, only to shatter under the impact of a vampire king defending his territory. Sophia's heartbeat grew stronger as Marcus claimed his first victory, the child's unique frequency somehow amplifying his vampire abilities while simultaneously draining his reserves in ways that Elena could see affecting his movements as exhaustion began accumulating despite supernatural endurance that should have been limitless. The feedback loop between protector and protected created ripple effects that extended beyond the warehouse. Supernatural disturbances that registered on equipment Elena couldn't see, but that attracted attention from creatures she'd never imagined, including Jake Morrison, who arrived outside with backup that included men carrying weapons designed for hunting things that weren't supposed to exist. David Chen and Marcus's other loyal vampires moved to intercept the human intrusion, their supernatural speed allowing them to create a perimeter around the warehouse that would keep Jake and his hired help from interfering with ancient protocols that demanded completion regardless of outside complications. Elena could hear gunfire and shouting from beyond the metal walls, evidence of a running battle between human ignorance and supernatural necessity. But her attention remained fixed on the arena where Valentina had begun her assault with the fluid grace that made her legendary among vampire assassins. The second champion attacked like liquid death given form and purpose, her movements so fast that Elena saw only blurred after-images as poison-tipped claws carved patterns in the air that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been designed to deliver doses of vampire venom calculated to cause maximum suffering before inevitable death. Marcus's enhanced abilities allowed him to match Valentina's speed for the first few exchanges, their battle becoming a deadly ballet performed at velocities that created sonic booms and pressure waves that cracked concrete and bent metal support beams like they were made of clay rather than industrial steel. The vampire assassin's strategy became clear as the fight progressed, her attacks designed not for immediate killing but for gradual poisoning that would weaken Marcus while leaving him conscious enough to experience every moment of his deterioration. Her venom working through his system like acid dissolving supernatural healing from within. Elena watched in terror as Marcus began to slow, his movements becoming labored, while Valentina danced around him with increasing confidence, her pale lips curved in a smile that promised victory and the kind of creative suffering that would serve as object lesson for any other vampire king foolish enough to choose humans over his own kind's expectations. Sophia's cry cut through the warehouse like a blade when Marcus stumbled and nearly fell, the baby's distress somehow triggering a purification process that burned the poison from his system with supernatural fire that left him gasping but whole, his vampire healing reasserting itself as Valentina stared in shock at the impossible reversal of her carefully planned victory. The revelation that followed changed everything Elena thought she understood about her daughter's nature. Sophia's heartbeat, not just affecting vampires, but serving as an amplifier for those who protected her, strengthening bonds forged in love rather than fear, and offering power to those who chose sacrifice over self-interest. Marcus used this unexpected advantage to turn the tide against Valentina, his renewed strength allowing him to match her speed, while his tactical experience provided the edge needed to finally corner the assassin against a wall where her mobility became liability rather than asset, his final strike ending her existence with mercy rather than the prolonged suffering she'd planned for him. Erebus stepped forward for the final battle with power that made the air itself tremble. His ancient magic transforming the warehouse into something that existed partially outside normal reality, shadows deepening until they became doorways to places that hurt Elena's mind to contemplate, while light bent around impossible geometries that suggested the vampire sorcerer commanded forces that predated human civilization. The magical assault revealed Sophia's true nature in ways that took Elena's breath away, the child's supernatural essence blazing like a beacon that illuminated her role as bridge between human and supernatural worlds. A living connection that could end the ancient conflicts that had shaped vampire society since its earliest nights. Erebus offered Marcus a choice that would have tempted lesser kings. The opportunity to use Sophia's amplifying power to destroy the Council entirely and remake vampire society according to his own vision. Unlimited authority purchased through the corruption of innocence that would turn a bridge into a weapon and a protector into a conqueror. Marcus rejected the offer with quiet dignity that surprised even Cassandra, choosing instead to face Erebus with only his own strength and 2 centuries of accumulated wisdom, accepting mortal wounds in exchange for protecting Sophia's pure nature from the kind of corruption that would save his throne while destroying everything that made victory worthwhile. Elena felt her heart break as she watched Marcus fall with Erebus's claws buried in his chest, the vampire king's sacrifice ensuring that their daughter would remain a force for healing rather than destruction, even as his own life bled away onto concrete that had witnessed too much violence and not enough mercy over the decades since its construction. The choice that followed would define everything that came after. Elena's decision whether to let Marcus die with honor intact, or use Sophia's power to save him, knowing that such intervention might change their daughter in ways that could never be undone, transforming her from bridge to weapon despite every sacrifice made to prevent exactly that outcome. Elena pressed Sophia against her chest and felt time crystallize around the moment of choice, her daughter's heartbeat pulsing with supernatural frequency that seemed to offer unlimited power in exchange for innocence that could never be reclaimed, once lost to the kind of violence that shaped vampire society through millennia of blood and conquest. Marcus lay bleeding on concrete stained with the evidence of battles that stretched back through the warehouse's history, his pale blue eyes focused on Elena with desperate intensity as he tried to communicate without words that she should let him die, rather than compromise Sophia's pure nature for the sake of preserving a monster who'd ruled through fear for 2 centuries. But Elena had learned too much about sacrifice and protection during their time together to accept that choice, her maternal instincts and growing love for the vampire king combining into determination that refused to acknowledge impossible as anything more than a word used by people who'd never faced the kind of desperate circumstances that demanded miracles from ordinary women who'd already given birth alone and survived abuse and chosen trust over terror when monsters knocked on motel room doors. Sophia's power flowed through Elena's hands like liquid starlight as she placed them on Marcus's wounded chest, the child's supernatural essence responding to her mother's will rather than vampire politics or council protocols, healing energy that carried no corruption because it came from love instead of hunger and protection instead of predation. The warehouse filled with light that hurt to look at directly, while Marcus's wounds closed under Elena's touch. Vampire flesh regenerating with speed that defied even supernatural healing as Sophia's frequency rewrote the fundamental rules governing his existence, binding the three of them together with connections that transcended species boundaries and created something unprecedented in the history of vampire-human relations. Cassandra watched the impossible healing with expressions that shifted from surprise to rage to calculation as she realized the implications of what she was witnessing. The ancient vampire's political instincts, recognizing that Sophia represented either salvation or destruction for supernatural society, depending on who controlled her development and how her power would be channeled as she grew from infant to child to something that might reshape the balance between hidden and revealed worlds. The council emissary's declaration that Sophia was too dangerous to live rang through the warehouse like a death sentence pronounced by divine authority, her voice carrying the weight of 3,000 years spent eliminating threats to vampire supremacy before they could mature into existential challenges to the natural order where humans served as livestock and supernatural predators ruled through absolute dominion over lesser species. Marcus rose from the concrete with strength that felt different from his previous vampire abilities. Sophia's healing having created changes that he could sense but not yet understand. Power that seemed cleaner somehow, and less dependent on the predatory instincts that had defined his existence since Catherine's fangs had ended his human life and begun his immortal reign of carefully controlled violence. The battle that followed split every vampire present into factions that revealed loyalties Elena hadn't suspected, David and Marcus's guards moving to protect Sophia, while other vampires sided with Cassandra's authority, their supernatural speed turning the warehouse into a battlefield where allegiances formed and dissolved faster than human eyes could track. Elena found herself no longer helpless as Cassandra targeted Sophia with claws that could have torn through steel, her weeks of training with Marcus paying off as she used iron weapons and UV lights with precision that surprised even herself, knowledge gained from desperate necessity, allowing her to outmaneuver a creature whose age should have made her invulnerable to human opposition. The ancient vampire's shock at facing effective resistance from a mortal woman provided the opening Marcus needed to engage Cassandra directly, his transformed abilities allowing him to match her speed while retaining strategic thinking that hadn't been compromised by millennia of casual cruelty and absolute power over beings too weak to fight back. Sophia's presence on the battlefield changed everything about vampire combat. Her heartbeat creating interference patterns that disrupted traditional magic while strengthening those who fought to protect rather than destroy, her innocent nature serving as catalyst for transformations that reached beyond physical healing into fundamental changes in supernatural essence. Marcus felt his humanity returning with each beat of Sophia's heart. Memories of his life as Dr. Marcus Delacroix resurging with clarity that brought back the oath he'd taken to preserve life above all else, vampire strength remaining intact while predatory instincts gave way to protective ones that aligned with purposes greater than personal survival or territorial dominance. Elena's growth from victim to warrior happened with supernatural acceleration as she wielded tools Marcus had taught her to use, her desperate love for Sophia providing motivation that transformed theoretical knowledge into practical skill, iron-burning vampire flesh, while UV light carved paths of destruction through shadows that had seemed impenetrable just moments before. The final confrontation between Marcus and Cassandra became something beyond simple combat, as Sophia's power revealed the true nature of vampire existence, stripping away centuries of accumulated corruption to expose the choice that every turned human faced between embracing monstrosity or finding ways to retain essential humanity despite supernatural transformation. Cassandra's defeat came not through superior violence, but through the revelation that her ancient power meant nothing against opponents who drew strength from love rather than fear, her dissolution into ash serving as object lesson for other vampires about the cost of choosing predation over protection in a world where innocence could literally purify corruption through proximity alone. The victory carried prices that Elena understood even as she celebrated Marcus's survival. Knowledge that the vampire world now knew about Sophia's existence and her unprecedented abilities. Information that would spread through supernatural networks with speed that made human communication seem glacial by comparison. Marcus struggled to comprehend the changes in his nature as Sophia's influence continued reshaping his vampire essence, humanity returning without weakness, while strength remained without the predatory hunger that had defined his existence since transformation. Evolution, that suggested possibilities for vampire society that no one had imagined before a child was born, with heartbeat capable of rewriting the fundamental rules governing supernatural existence. Elena realized that saving Marcus meant accepting responsibility for consequences that would extend far beyond their makeshift family, the Vampire King's transformation serving as proof of concept for changes that could revolutionize relations between human and supernatural worlds if properly guided, but might trigger wars that could devastate both species if mishandled by those who preferred the brutal simplicity of predator versus prey dynamics. The warehouse fell silent, except for Sophia's gentle breathing as vampire survivors processed what they'd witnessed. Ancient creatures grappling with evidence that their fundamental assumptions about power and hierarchy and the natural order might be nothing more than choices that could be unmade by innocence wielded with sufficient determination and love. Marcus looked at Elena with eyes that held depths she'd never seen before. Humanity and vampire nature blending into something new that suggested possibilities for their future together, that transcended the desperate circumstances that had brought them to this moment of transformation and revelation. David approached them with careful respect as he processed the implications of his king's evolution. Vampire loyalty, adapting to serve purposes that prioritized protection over predation, while maintaining the strength necessary to enforce peace, in a world where violence remained the most common language spoken by supernatural entities. Elena understood that Marcus would have to restructure vampire society around principles that most of his kind had never considered. Protection of special humans like Sophia, rather than predation upon ordinary ones. Evolution from parasite to symbiote that would require changes touching every aspect of how supernatural creatures related to the world around them. The Vampire King's transformation meant abandoning traditional methods of rule based on fear and dominance, replacing them with systems built on mutual benefit and shared responsibility for maintaining the balance between hidden and revealed worlds that protected both species from the kind of exposure that would lead to warfare devastating beyond imagination. Elena's role evolved from protected refugee to active partner in reshaping vampire politics, her human perspective providing insights that centuries of supernatural existence had hidden from Marcus and his court, bridge between worlds that could facilitate understanding while maintaining necessary boundaries. Sophia stirred in her mother's arms, as if sensing the momentous changes surrounding her birth, brown eyes opening to reveal awareness that seemed far too mature for an infant, but carried no threat beyond the kind of innocent curiosity that could transform ancient hatreds into opportunities for cooperation between species that had been enemies since the first vampire chose to feed on human blood rather than seeking alternatives. Marcus carried them from the warehouse with movements that felt different from his previous vampire grace. Power that served protection rather than predation, radiating from his transformed nature, as Elena processed the reality that they'd survived their first supernatural crisis, but would face many more as news of Sophia's abilities spread through networks that connected every vampire court in the world. The desert stretched endlessly around them, under stars that seemed brighter somehow, as if Sophia's presence had begun affecting reality itself in ways that extended beyond supernatural entities into the fundamental forces that governed existence, changes that promised either unprecedented peace or conflicts that would make previous vampire wars seem like minor disagreements between neighbors. Elena looked at Marcus, carrying their daughter with tenderness that had survived his transformation intact. Vampire King evolved into something new while retaining everything that had made her love him, despite the danger and impossibility of their situation, and she realized that whatever came next would be faced together by a family that had been forged in supernatural fire and tempered by choices that prioritized love over power and protection over personal survival. 6 months after the warehouse confrontation that had reshaped vampire society's understanding of what was possible when love challenged ancient laws written in blood and enforced through centuries of fear. The Moonrise Motel stood transformed into something unprecedented in supernatural history, a sanctuary where creatures who had spent lifetimes hiding their true nature could find refuge alongside humans fleeing threats that existed beyond normal understanding of danger and violence. Elena moved through the renovated lobby with confidence that would have seemed impossible during those desperate hours when she'd given birth alone in room 12. Her understanding of vampire politics and supernatural diplomacy growing daily as refugees arrived, seeking protection from conflicts that raged across territories where old hierarchies crumbled under pressure from Marcus's revolutionary approach to leadership through cooperation rather than domination. The woman who had once trembled at shadows now negotiated treaties between werewolf packs and vampire courts, her human perspective providing insights that centuries of supernatural existence had hidden from beings who'd forgotten what it meant to choose mercy over strength or protection over personal advantage. Marcus watched her work with admiration that deepened daily as Elena demonstrated capabilities that had been forged in crisis but refined through months of careful study and practical application. Her innate intelligence allowing her to grasp complex power dynamics while maintaining the humanity that made her an effective mediator between species that had been enemies since time immemorial. The Vampire King himself had evolved into something that defied traditional categories. His nature transformed by Sophia's continuing influence into a hybrid of immortal strength and mortal compassion that served as living proof that redemption was possible, even for creatures who'd spent centuries defining themselves through predatory instincts and territorial violence. Marcus's court had adapted to serve his new vision with loyalty that surprised even David. Vampires who'd followed him for decades, discovering that protecting the innocent provided purpose that mere survival or territorial expansion had never offered. Their supernatural abilities channeled toward defense, rather than conquest, in ways that attracted others seeking alternatives to the endless cycles of conflict that had characterized vampire society since its earliest nights. Sophia, at 6 months, displayed development that transcended normal infant milestones, while maintaining the innocent wonder that had initially triggered her extraordinary abilities, her brown eyes tracking movements that existed beyond human perception, while her presence continued calming both supernatural visitors and human refugees, who found unexpected peace in proximity to the child whose heartbeat had already changed so many lives. The baby's empathic abilities manifested in subtle ways that Elena documented with scientific precision. Moments when crying children would quiet at Sophia's touch, or wounded animals would seek her proximity for healing that seemed to accelerate natural recovery processes without the dramatic displays of power that had marked her early influence on Marcus's transformation. Elena knew that other supernatural factions had taken notice of these developments, reports filtering through networks that connected every hidden community across the globe, as news spread about a child whose abilities suggested possibilities for evolution that threatened established orders built on separation between species and dominion through superior force rather than mutual cooperation. The letters arrived weekly from vampire courts and werewolf councils and magical covens whose leaders sought audience with the family that had proven change was possible, some offering alliance while others carried barely concealed threats about consequences for those who disrupted balances that had maintained peace through carefully negotiated boundaries between competing supernatural interests. Marcus read these communications with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive and in power for 2 centuries, his strategic mind calculating threats and opportunities, while his transformed nature sought solutions that didn't require the kind of preemptive violence that had once been his primary tool for maintaining control over territories that respected only strength and feared nothing more than signs of weakness from their rulers. Elena understood that their victory over Cassandra had been only the opening move in a larger conflict that would determine whether Sophia's influence would spread peaceful evolution throughout supernatural society or trigger wars that could expose both worlds to destruction that neither species would survive intact. The immediate danger had passed, but the broader implications of their choices continued rippling outward like stones dropped in still water, creating waves that would eventually reach every corner of the hidden world, where creatures of myth and legend struggled to adapt to realities that challenged everything they'd believed about the natural order and their place within hierarchies built on assumptions that a child's heartbeat had proven false. Despite the ongoing threats that manifested in surveillance and political maneuvering, and occasional direct challenges from factions that preferred traditional methods of resolving disputes, Elena and Marcus had created something unprecedented in their makeshift family that bridged two worlds previously separated by centuries of mutual fear and predatory relationship dynamics. Hope had taken root in the Nevada desert, where a roadside motel served as headquarters for a revolution that prioritized protection over power and healing over conquest, demonstrating that love could indeed transform monsters into guardians when given opportunity to flourish under conditions that rewarded compassion rather than punishing it as weakness requiring correction. The Moonrise Motel operated with efficiency that balanced legitimate business needs against its secret purpose as neutral ground, where supernatural refugees could find temporary safety, while Elena and Marcus worked to establish more permanent solutions for beings caught between worlds that offered little tolerance for those who didn't fit neatly into established categories of friend or enemy. Jake Morrison had made one final attempt to claim Sophia through legal channels that relied on human authorities who had no understanding of supernatural circumstances surrounding her birth. His arrival at the motel with court papers and hired muscle representing the last threat from Elena's human past that required permanent resolution. Marcus's response had been swift and final. Jake's permanent removal from their lives accomplished with methods that ensured he would never again threaten anyone, while leaving no evidence that would attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies whose investigations might compromise the sanctuary they'd worked so hard to establish. Elena felt no regret for the ex-boyfriend whose abuse had driven her to desperate flight across 3 states. Recognizing that some threats could only be resolved through decisive action that prioritized protection of innocence over moral complexity that had no place in decisions involving child safety and family survival. The motel's transformation into supernatural sanctuary had required extensive renovations that disguised advanced security systems behind rustic desert charm. UV lighting and iron reinforcements and magical wards that David had commissioned from practitioners whose skills predated human civilization, all designed to protect refugees while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary business that attracted no special attention from passing travelers or government agencies. Marcus's territory had expanded beyond traditional vampire concepts of hunting grounds and feeding areas into something resembling a small nation dedicated to protecting those who fell between cracks in systems designed for pure humans or pure supernatural beings, his rule based on consent and mutual benefit rather than fear and absolute dominance over subjects who had no choice but submission or death. Elena's integration into vampire society had progressed with surprising smoothness, as her diplomatic skills proved invaluable for negotiations that required someone who understood both human and supernatural perspectives, her position as Marcus's partner providing authority that ancient creatures respected, while her mortal nature offered insights that centuries of existence had hidden from beings who'd forgotten what vulnerability felt like. Sophia's future remained uncertain but promising as her development continued along paths that defied normal expectations, aging at human rates while displaying supernatural awareness that suggested abilities yet to be discovered. her presence serving as catalyst for changes that extended far beyond the family that loved her, into realms where species barriers were dissolving under pressure from evidence that cooperation offered advantages that competition could never achieve. Room 12 had been transformed into a nursery that combined practical child-rearing necessities with protective measures designed to shield Sophia from supernatural influences that might accelerate her development in dangerous directions. The space where she'd been born now serving as sanctuary, where she could grow at natural pace while surrounded by love that transcended species boundaries and biological limitations. Marcus spent hours reading to Sophia from ancient vampire texts that he'd begun rewriting to include concepts of hope and redemption alongside traditional lessons about power and survival, his voice carrying warmth that would have seemed impossible during his centuries of ruling through calculated distance and strategic cruelty that had kept lesser vampires in line through fear alone. The letter that arrived from an ancient vampire clan in Eastern Europe requesting sanctuary for their own special children marked the beginning of a new chapter in their story. Evidence that news of Sophia's influence had spread to the oldest bloodlines on Earth and attracted attention from beings whose age and power dwarfed even Marcus's considerable abilities, but who recognized that evolution sometimes required guidance from those who'd already walked paths leading toward transformation rather than destruction. Elena read the carefully worded request with understanding that their work at the Moonrise Motel was just beginning, that they'd become guardians of a new supernatural order that would require decades of careful nurturing to reach maturity. But the family they'd created provided foundations strong enough to support whatever challenges would emerge from a world where ancient enemies were learning to become allies through shared commitment to protecting innocence rather than exploiting it. The Vampire King sat in the transformed nursery with Elena and Sophia, his ancient eyes focused on texts that contained wisdom accumulated over centuries, but rewritten to include possibilities that previous generations had never imagined. Love providing context that transformed predatory instincts into protective ones while maintaining strength necessary for defending those who chose cooperation over conflict. In a universe that still contained beings who preferred traditional methods of resolving disputes through violence and domination. Marcus had spent centuries learning to take life with efficiency that marked him as apex predator among creatures already positioned at the top of supernatural food chains. But holding his human family in the peaceful sanctuary they'd created together, he was finally learning how to give life back to a world that had almost forgotten what healing looked like when applied by those who chose love over power and protection, over personal advantage, in decisions that would shape the future for generations yet to come.